Welcome to the Escape from the Coasts conference. I actually delivered this talk at the conference on Saturday, but there was a little glitch with the technology. So although the later talks are recorded live at the event, my talk didn't, which introduced the whole event. So I thought it might be a good idea just to do it again in the happy confines of one of these VC rooms in Shetland College, and it will be added onto the other talks. Okay, well, let's get started. As we're all very well aware, Shetland lies midway between Norway and Scotland. What we might not be quite so well aware about is the vital role that Shetland played during the Second World War. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. To begin with, I'd like to describe the events that took place in Norway in 1940, and this will provide the background for the story. On the 3rd of April, 1940, Germany launched Operation Weserübung, which was a joint operation involving the German Army, Navy and Air Force to take over Norway. The main reason for the German invasion was to ensure that the Allies would not be able to blockade Germany as they'd done before in World War I, and also to secure the port of Narvik with its supply of iron ore, which was vital to the German war effort. Germany was also worried that Britain might violate Norway's neutrality and occupy the country. The towns of Bergen, Kristiansand, Stavanger, Trondheim and Narvik quickly fell into German hands. However, the British responded on the 10th of April when 5 British destroyers attacked the Germans in Narvik. The Germans lost 2 destroyers, but the British had to withdraw. On the 13th of April, the British warship HMS Warspite and 7 destroyers again attacked the Germans in the town of Narvik. This was a success, and the 7 remaining German destroyers were sunk. On the 16th and 17th of April, there were also British landings at Namsos and Åndalsnes in order to launch an attack on Trondheim. However, this wasn't a success, and it became clear that southern and central Norway were securely in German hands. The result was that on the 27th of April, British forces were commanded to evacuate south and central Norway. This evacuation was completed by the 1st and 2nd of May, and on the 3rd of May, Norwegian forces in these areas surrendered. However, northern Norway still remained largely unoccupied. The situation, however, changed when, on the 10th of May 1940, the Germans opened their campaign in France, and Churchill became Prime Minister. Clearly, the German proximity to southern England focused minds, and on the 25th of May, Churchill instructed Major General Auchinleck to evacuate northern Norway too. However, he was to attack Narvik first to cover their withdrawal and to deny German future iron ore exports if possible. And on the 28th of May, the Allied troops took Narvik, which they held until the 8th of June, when they unfortunately had to withdraw. With no other prospect, King Haakon and the Norwegian government also withdrew from Tromsø to the north and went into exile. And on the 10th of June, Norway formally capitulated, 2 months after Weserübung. Despite ultimately being unsuccessful, the British attack on Narvik did prove that the Germans were not entirely invincible. The losses on both sides were high. The British lost 4,500 men, 3 cruisers, 8 destroyers, an aircraft carrier called the HMS Glorious, and 112 aircraft. The French and Poles each lost 500 men, and the Norwegians lost 1,800 men. On the Axis side, the Germans lost 5,000 men, 3 cruisers, 10 destroyers, 4 U-boats, and 242 aircraft. Considering the relative sizes of the navies, the loss of ships was more of a problem to the Germans than to the British. However, the Germans had completed their conquest of Norway, and according to Hitler, Norway was now to become a zone of destiny. He was very keen on having the Norwegians, which he saw as good Aryans, as part of his Reich, and he originally wanted to treat them reasonably well. However, having to hold on to Norway meant that a large German occupation force was tied up during the war defending Norway's extensive coastline. The invasion and subsequent occupation of Norway led to an exodus of Norwegians who didn't want to associate themselves with Hitler's plans for their country. They headed both to the east and to the west. The largest number headed east over Norway's long land border with Sweden, and during the war more than 50,000 Norwegians fled in that direction. These refugees were sent to camps at Øreryd in Småland and Hjeseter in Södermanland. From the summer of 1943 onwards, the military training of Norwegian troops was carried out in Sweden, in cooperation with the Swedish government and the Norwegian government in exile in London. To prevent protests from Nazi Germany, this training was ostensibly for the Norwegian police. From the start, the recruits only had light infantry weapons, but later they were able to train with artillery. Military exercises were held in Dalarna in December 1944 and in Hälsingland in spring 1945. 8,000 men took part in this latter exercise. In all, around 15,000 men were trained and organised into 10 battalions, and at the end of the war, 8 of these battalions, about 13,500 men, were ready for action. They entered Norway on May 8, 1945. Many of those who fled to Sweden came from eastern Norway. However, those who lived along the lengthy Norwegian coast chose to flee in a different direction. They chose to head west in small boats to Britain. Particularly, they headed for Shetland. This group became known in Norway as the Englandsfarere, or the Englandfarers. Most of those who headed west were young, unmarried men, on average between the ages of 19 and 23. They left their homeland mainly with the aim of joining the Allies, so they could fight the Germans. Some 10,000 were women. Some 10% were women. They came from the entire length of the Norwegian west coast. However, some communities were particularly notable for the number of people who decided to head for Britain. For example, from the small island of Vigra, which had a population of around 1,200, between 70 and 80 headed west, and from the fishing village of Trelleborg, near Bergen, with a population of about 400, some 50 people followed suit. Overall, about 5,000 people headed west in military and civilian vessels. About 300 Norwegian civilian boats, mostly small fishing boats, were involved, and they carried about 3,300 people. 16 boats sank and 137 people died. 13 expeditions with 121 people were stopped and taken by the enemy. Of these, 51 were executed and 9 died in captivity. Many of those who assisted were sent into exile or executed, and the total cost in human life of this Englandsfarere event was over 320 Norwegian dead. The flotilla of boats started to head west to Shetland as soon as the Germans launched Operation Weserübung. They brought refugees and British and Norwegian servicemen. Lerwick Harbour has a series of records which report that the following boats arrived in Shetland between the 3rd and the 28th of May. And it's quite a good idea just to list them and to itemise who was on these boats, because it gives a clear picture of what was going on. On the 3rd of May, the Borgund from Ålesund arrived with 42 German prisoners of war, as did the Bergholm, that also appeared on that date. On the 4th of May, the Jobek from Ålesund, with 20 people, including soldiers from Bergen, an engineer and his wife and child, and a couple of officers and a female announcer from Bergen arrived, as did the Boma, with 12 refugees. On the 5th of May, it was the Bjerk, a guard boat with a doctor, 2 medical students and 5 volunteers. On the 6th of May, it was the Veststein from Måløy with 8 people, including 4 soldiers who'd taken part in the fighting near Voss. On the 9th of May, the Violet, the Pura from Trelleborg with 2 people, and the Sjöguten from Fosnavåg with 19 people, among them an Air Force captain and his staff, who were involved in establishing the new Norwegian Air Force, arrived. On the 10th of May, the Vita from Bremnes with 6 people, 4 of whom were naval officers, the Havørn from Måløy with 20 people, among whom were 11 who were British, who had arrived at Åndalsnes, 2 Jews from Austria who were escaping from Oslo, and 7 Norwegians. There was also the Sandvikon from Fosnavåg with 6 Norwegians, half a troop of British soldiers, and a German prisoner. And there was the Western, also from Fosnavåg, with about 10 or 12 British soldiers and 7 Norwegians. On the 12th of May, the Leif from Måløy with 18 people, 14 of whom were British soldiers, the rest Norwegians. The 13th of May, the Reda from Bryggja, the Nordfjord with 4 British and 3 Norwegians. And on the 18th of May, the Vest from Sailandsvik with 7 people, 4 of whom were British, all arrived. Then on the 20th of May, the Snål from Maastricht with 8 people, among them a British diplomat, appeared at Lerwick. Then on the 28th of May, the Bresund from Ålesund nearly made it to Lerwick, but sank off Unst. However, the passengers were saved, and 6 Norwegians and 5 British were amongst them. All in all, during 1940, 56 boats fled from Norway, of which 30 boats arrived in Shetland. They carried 200 refugees, plus 100 British servicemen and Norwegian service personnel. Of the boats, 11 came from Ålesund, 7 from Bergen, Sotra and Stavanger, 5 from Måløy, 4 from Florø and Selje, 3 from Bumle and Karmøy, and 1 from Trelleborg. In 1941, the numbers increased. Nearly 4 times as many boats left Norway, 191 in all, mostly in the months of August and September. Of these, 120 reached Lerwick, carrying 1,880 refugees, including 155 women and 24 children. For example, the Børfjord from Askvoll arrived in Lerwick on the 10th of June with 12 people. The boat had been purchased by the Årstadbrun Export Group, one of the groups who organised clandestine refugee escapes. And amongst the escapees were fisherman Gerhard Bergsvik and machinist Peter Sira, who went on to take part in the Norwegian motor torpedo boat operations against the Germans, which were organised from Lerwick. To try and halt this exodus, on the 26th of September 1941, the Germans extended the death penalty to anyone attempting to leave Norway. This had an effect, as you can imagine, and in 1942 only 17 boats left Norway. However, refugees continued to be picked up by boats involved in the Shetland bus missions, and for example, even as late as the winter of 1944-45, 225 refugees were brought back to Shetland from Norway on the Shetland bus subchasers. Well, what was to be done with all these refugees? Initially, the onus for looking after the Norwegians fell on James Garrick, the Norwegian vice-consul based in Lerwick. He had to house them, feed them, and sometimes clothe them. And for his sterling efforts, he was awarded the Order of St. Olaf First Class for his work. After being registered, fed, watered, and dried off, they were quickly sent south to the Royal Victoria Patriotic School in Wandsworth, London, where they were interviewed and quizlings were weeded out. Soon a camp was established at James Sutherland's herring station at the foot of Browns Road in Lerwick, and Mr. and Mrs. James Aidy were put in charge. Luckily, she was Norwegian and could communicate with the new arrivals. In London, many Norwegians joined the war effort. Some were recruited into the commando unit called the Norwegian Independent Company, formed in March 1941, which was a British Special Operations Executive Group, better known as the Company Linge, after its leader, Captain Martin Linge. Many came back to Shetland, where some joined the Norwegian Air Force at Solomvo, where 600 Norwegians were based, while others joined the Shetland Bus. Others returned to Scotland to continue working as fishermen in towns like Buckie, where between 300 and 400 Norwegians lived during the war. In Norway, clandestine groups appeared in a number of areas to organise help for the refugees. finding boats and provisions. It was a very dangerous activity to be involved in. And in Bergen, there were the Årstabrun and the Stein groups, and in Ålesund, there were the Bømlo and Bremnes groups, and the Torsvik and Vala groups. So it's Bergen and Ålesund were particularly strong in this clandestine activity. Unfortunately, as German intelligence improved during 1942, most of the export groups were eliminated. The fate of the Stein organisation was particularly sad. Its leader was Christian Elias Stein, and it had around 1,500 members based in and around Bergen. Unfortunately, it was infiltrated by a Gestapo agent called Marino Nielsen. He came to Bergen from Ålesund at the beginning of 1941, pretending that he needed to escape. He passed information to the Gestapo, and 200 men were arrested and taken to Bergen prison. Later, they were moved to the Gestapo headquarters for 2 months, where they were tortured. Then they were sent to a prison camp called Ulven, south of Bergen, for 6 months. In May 1942, they were sent to Oslo, and then onwards to Kiel for a year, where they arrived as Nacht- und Nebel prisoners. That means effectively they were invisible and without any rights. And in the autumn of 1943, they were taken to Rendsburg to be tried. About 20 were executed, and the others were sentenced to 3 to 8 years of hard labour in special camps. Some were sent to Sonnenberg, southwest of Leipzig, which was an old monastery which housed 1,200 in terrible conditions. In October 1944, they were moved to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Others were sent to Dachau. In all, 51 out of the 200 died in addition to those shot. The exposure of the Stein gang led to an increase in the demand for places on boats escaping to Shetland. After the Weserübung, the British authorities were aware of the small boats arriving from Norway. Plans were quickly developed to use them in the war effort. By November 1940, the Special Operations Executive, which had been established earlier in the year by Churchill to wage clandestine warfare behind enemy lines, had decided to establish ME7, Military Establishment 7, which would be based in Shetland. Captain Leslie Mitchell was sent to organise the operation. He requisitioned Flemington, now Gerrard House, as his HQ, and later he appointed David Howarth, who wrote an account of the Shetland Bus, as his second-in-command. The Shetland Bus is the English nickname for the operation that was established. The Norwegian name is Shetlandsgjengen, the Shetland Gang. Mitchell's first mission was just before Christmas 1940, when the Vita, under skipper Hilmar Langøyen, who had been a member of the Årstabrun export group, made a trip to Nordhordland, returning on Christmas Day. And by May 1941, when Sub-Lieutenant David Howarth arrived, 6 boats were available for action, and they'd carried out 13 trips to the Norwegian coast from Bømlo to Trondheim. These trips had taught them that the missions would have to be carried out during the winter months, in darkness, when the weather was at its worst. Also, that as the German aircraft made many patrols along the coast out to about 50 miles offshore, the boats had to reach the 50-mile distance as darkness fell, so that they could be in a believable fishing position before daybreak, so as not to raise suspicion. Lerwick itself, followed by the little fjord of Katforth, had been used as the base for the first expeditions, but they were, for various reasons, unsuitable, and a new base was needed. Lunna, with its little sheltered harbour, its distance from prying eyes, and its large mansion house for an HQ and crew accommodation, was chosen, and by the end of July 1941 it was ready. The first trip from Lunna was organised at the end of August, when August Nairobi commanded the 65-foot-long Axel, which had come from Jyske, just outside Ålesund, arriving in Lerwick only on May the 7th, so it had only been in Shetland for a couple of months. The mission was to deliver a messenger to a point north of Bergen in order to re-establish contact with the Norwegian underground. This was done successfully, and the crew also enjoyed the hospitality of the local Norwegian girls, with whom they went to a dance. The Axel returns safely from Norway on the 5th of September. A number of ships were acquired, including the Siglaås, Nordsjön, Arthur, Erkna, Heland, Olaf and Jack. And new skippers, including Leif Larsen, Gunnar Gunderson, Per Blystad and Peter Gudoy, joined the inn. During the winter of 1941-42, they carried out around 40 trips, 43 agents were landed, 9 picked up, 130 tons of arms were put ashore, and 45 refugees were brought over. Despite the early successes, this was a very dangerous operation, as they had to avoid being attacked by the Germans, and they had the weather to contend with. There were losses. The first ship to be lost was the Vita in September 1941. She was seized and the crew interned. In October 1941, the Norsjön was lost, having set mines north of Trondheim. Luckily, the crew survived, stole another fishing boat, the Arthur, and returned to Shetland. The crew of the Vlia were not so lucky. In November 1941, the Vlia it disappeared in a ferocious storm, and the 42 on board were all lost, including 6 crew members and 36 refugees, and this was the biggest single loss of life suffered by the operation. It was not only dangerous for the Shetland bus crews, any association with the Shetland bus operation could end in tragedy, such as the events that happened in the small fishing settlement of Hellebog almost exactly 75 years ago. On the 26th of April 1942, after having discovered that Lauritz and Marta Tella were hiding the 2 men from the Linge Company, Arna Meldan Weirum and Emil Gustav Kval, who'd arrived in a boat from Shetland, the Gestapo arrived to arrest them. Shots were exchanged, and 2 prominent German Gestapo officers, Kriminalrat Gerhard Berns and Kriminalsekretär Henry Bertram, were shot dead. Weirum was also killed in the incident. Kval was executed a few months later. Reichskommissar Josef Terboven, who controlled the Nazi regime in Norway, oversaw the reprisal, which was quick and brutal. On the 30th of April, all the buildings were destroyed, all boats were sunk or confiscated, and all livestock taken away. 72 men were deported to Sachsenhausen, and 31 died in captivity. 268 women and children were imprisoned for 2 years, and 18 Norwegian prisoners held at the Trandum internment camp were executed as a reprisal. And Hellebog joins the villages of Oradour-sur-Glane in France, Lidice in the Czech Republic, and Putten in the Netherlands as examples of villages which were destroyed as part of Nazi terror. During 1942, the Shetland bus operations were moved from Lunna to Scalloway. Lunna had proven to be just too isolated, too lacking in repair facilities, and too boring for the young men. It was sapping their morale. Scalloway, on the other hand, was a better prospect for the staff of roughly 30 British and 70 Norwegians. The village had people to socialise with, effectively girls. There was accommodation available in the old Met store, now called Norway House, and there was somewhere to store the ammo. And most importantly, there was Jack Moore's engineering workshop, which became entirely devoted to maintaining the Shetland bus. Ultimately, there were 9 Shetlanders and 6 Norwegians employed on the staff. All Scalloway needed was a slipway for the boats, and this was quickly built and officially named the Prince Olaf Slipway in October 1942. The Shetland bus boats then started to arrive from Lunna, and these included the Heland, the Axel, the Freya, the Arthur, the Harald, the Segleås, the Fejøy, and the larger 75-foot whaling vessels, the Brattholm, Bergholm, Andholm, and Sandøy. There's the Heland, there's the Axel. Although the bus operations were being transferred to Scalloway, Lunna was used as the base from which to launch the famous David and Goliath attack on the German battleship Tirpitz, which weighed in at an intimidating 42,000 tons. It was anchored in Trondheimsfjord. It posed a great threat to Allied forces in the North Sea and was tying up the British Navy in Scapa Flow. The Arthur, captained by Leif Larsen, sailed to Norway on the 26th of October with 2 mini-subs called Chariots and their British crews. They were going to attempt to sink the Tirpitz. Well, it would have been an extraordinary event if they'd managed to do that. And they might just have done it, but unfortunately within 5 miles of the battleship and still undetected, the subs were lost to bad weather. They had to scuttle the Arthur and made it ashore, and then they headed for Sweden. Unfortunately, able seaman Robert Evans was wounded in a gunfight near the Swedish border and taken prisoner. He was nursed back to health, then executed under the commando order. The winter of 1942-43 was an increasingly tragic time for the bus. The Axel sank 200 miles north of Shetland, and the Sandoy and the Fea were lost with all hands. The Brattholm had also been lost with only one survivor, the incredible Jan Balsrud, whose escape over the Norwegian mountains into Sweden and his endurance have entered legend. Half of the Frøya's crew had been lost, the Arthur had been scuttled on the Tirpitz affair, and the Bergholm had sunk with the loss of a man. Over half of the fleet had been lost, with about half of the crews. It was becoming untenable. German defences had improved, and fuel oil was so scarce in Norway that the larger fishing boats had given up fishing, which meant that the larger Shetland bus boats were too obvious. It was becoming increasingly clear that the operation could not continue for much longer if it remained reliant on the fishing boats. However, they had proved their effectiveness. There were almost 100 missions in total from Shetland to Norway using small fishing vessels. Nonetheless, 10 boats and 44 men had been lost to winter conditions and German surveillance. However, the Shetland bus wasn't finished, because the Americans came to the rescue. In August 1943, Admiral Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the American Naval Forces in Europe, ordered 3 fast sub-chasers, powered by twin 1200 HP engines, to be sent to Britain and allotted to the Shetland bus. They were given Norwegian island names, Hessa, Hitra and Vigra, and these proved to be highly successful. Compared to the fishing vessels, they were much better armed, having cannons at both stern and bow, and a Colt machine gun on each bridge wing. They were also much faster. The fishing boats might achieve 5 knots, whereas the sub-chasers could reach 16 knots. And after they came into service, not a single man or vessel was lost during the remainder of the war. In the winter of 1943-44, the sub-chasers proved their worth, making 34 trips. They landed 41 agents, picked up 13, and rescued a number of refugees. In the winter of 1944-45, they landed a further 94 agents, picked up 33, and rescued 225 refugees. There can be no doubt that the operation was a success. In all, 198 trips were made to Norway, and over 383 tons of military equipment were transported. This amounted to most of the weapons and materials used in southern Norway by the Norwegian home front. In addition, 192 agents were landed, 73 agents were returned, and 373 refugees were brought to safety. The Shetland bus was also immensely important for propaganda, bringing hope to occupied Norway. It also played its part in British military policy towards Norway, a policy which involved planning small and large-scale operations against the Germans, which did its bit to convince Hitler that the British were going to return to the European mainland in force through Norway. And in fact, during 1941 and 42, the British did consider Norway as a location for the potential second front. In 1942, Hitler demanded that the German army and air force in Norway be reinforced and coastal defences be strengthened. Between the middle of 1941 and June 1944, there were between 9 and 12 German divisions in the country. By January 1945, there were 15 divisions in Norway. This is a huge number of troops, especially given the pressure on the German army elsewhere. In addition to the 340,000 German troops, much of the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, was also tied up in Norway. These were forces that could have aided the German war effort if they'd been deployed elsewhere. However, it must be remembered that 44 crewmen lost their lives. They are commemorated twice a year in Scalaway on May the 17th, Norway's Constitution Day, and on Armistice Sunday. Everyone involved in the bus should be regarded as a hero. And it's a shame to pick anyone out. However, these are two of these heroes, Kåre Iversen and Leif Larsen. Between them, they made over 100 trips to Norway, and perhaps the most dramatic of those that Larsen made, and the one which best shows his will and determination, was his mission to Træna in Nordland in March 1943. A resistance group was based in Træna, and Larsen's task as skipper of the Bergholm was to land 3 agents and 4 tons of arms and equipment. On the way back to Shetland, Larsen's boat was attacked by 2 German planes and left in a sinking condition. Although 5 of the 8-man crew aboard were hit, they got into a small, clumsy rowing boat. They were 75 miles from the nearest point of the Norwegian coast and 350 miles from Shetland. Larsen decided that as they had friends in the Ålesund area, 150 miles away, they would row, even though only 3 of them were fit. 2 men rowed at one time, while the third looked after the wounded. Sadly, the young Niels Vika died of his injuries, and he was buried at sea. After rowing for 4 days, they reached the Ålesund area, and sometime later they were picked up and saved by a motor torpedo boat sent over from Lerwick in Shetland to find them. Today, this heroic era in Norwegian history is remembered in Bergen with its sculpture of Leif Larsen, and in Ålesund it's commemorated in a memorial to the Englandsfarere who took their boats to seek freedom and safety. In Scalloway, we have the Shetland Bus Memorial, which has seen its share of important visitors, including Queen Sonja of Norway, who visited in 2007. There are also 2 excellent museums that each in their own way tell the story of this extraordinary period. In the rebuilt village of Trelleborg, there's the Nordsjöfartsmuseet, the North Sea Maritime Museum, which opened on the 26th of April 1998, 50 years after the shootout between the Linge boys and the Gestapo. It has a permanent exhibition dealing with the Trelleborg tragedy. And of course, in Shetland, we have the Scalloway Museum, owned by the Shetland Bus Friendship Society, which has an excellent exhibition of everything to do with the Shetland bus. What of the boats themselves? Not many of the boats survive. However, the fishing boat MK Andholmen, which braved gales and the German attacks while crossing 8 times to Norway, is still with us, as is the sub-chaser KNM Hitra, which successfully carried out 43 missions. And a final memorial, which those who were at the conference can see this afternoon, is the film Shetlandsgjengen, which came out in 1954, which was made in Norway, with the cast made up of the Shetland bus men themselves. That is a fitting memorial to the events. The filming is extraordinary, and you get a real feeling for the experience that these men had, both braving the German attack and the terrible weather that they had to sail through. And with that, I'd like to bring this bit of the talk to an end, and I look forward to hearing from the other speakers. Thank you.
You are the only call in this conference.